and I'm the artistic director of Bunnell Street Art Center. For about 18 weeks, we have presented dialogues to illuminate current issues and empower audiences across Alaska and beyond with creative strategies for maneuvering challenging times. Today is the second in a 5-week series of conversations about Indigenous land acknowledgement. And I want to say that I'm a lifelong visitor on this land called Tuggeght by the Dena'ina, meaning shore or at the water. Bunnell occupies a Western-style building, which was formerly a trading post erected by settlers on Ketchimak Bay in the 1930s. As such, it was a critical tool in the strategy of colonization for this region, supplying settlers with food and supplies for westward expansion, homesteading, and land claims. Today, with support from National Performance Network's Community Fund and the Social Justice Fund of Alaska Community Foundation, our many members, our devoted board, we strive to transform this space and its role in community, centering Indigenous artists and activists and advancing awareness, participation, and visible acknowledgement of Indigenous lands. These activities attest to ongoing, sustainable Indigenous lifeways since time immemorial, which continue to steward this place. Our conversation today is titled Where We Begin, Tugge't, Learning about Land Acknowledgement with Emily Johnson and Amber Webb. Amber is Yup'ik and Unangan from Land Acknowledgement, Alaska. She received a Rasmuson Individual Artist Award and a Project Award. She explores pictorial Yup'ik storytelling to tell contemporary stories of oppression and resilience. Emily Johnson is an artist who makes body-based work, a Bessie Award-winning choreographer and a 2015 Guggenheim Fellow in choreography. She is based in New York. Raised in Soldotna, she is of Yup'ik descent. So I'd like to set the stage for this dialogue together and ask Amber, as a contemporary artist based in rural Alaska, could you begin by pronouncing the names of the place where you live and providing all of us a picture of the Alaska context and themes that have shaped you? I'm interested in how you might address the ongoing impacts of colonization, the trauma triggered by the current pandemic, and ongoing violence and disappearance of Indigenous women. From your perspective, help us understand why this makes acts of land acknowledgement so critically important, Amber. Thank you.
So this is a very interesting subject to be speaking about right now. The original name of the place where I'm from is Choreographer, which means churning water in Yup'ik, and it's where the Wood River and the Nushagak River meet in Bristol Bay. So it's where the fresh water meets the salt water. And I live currently in Aleknagik, which has its original place name still. And Choreographer is now called Dillingham. Well, what became Dillingham was the area called Kanakanak, the area called Choreographer, and then various other locations that kind of all meshed together, and they named it Dillingham after a senator from Iowa, I think, at some point. But so my goal is to eventually have the name of Dillingham changed back to Choreographer, because that's the name of the place. So what I've been trying to do is begin introducing myself as Amber Webb from Choreographer, Alaska, but a lot of people don't know what I'm talking about. So then it kind of creates a space to open a conversation about it, which is good. But sometimes I just say I'm from Dillingham because maybe for the sake of expediency, which I have mixed feelings about. But the other thing we're working on here right now, there's a creek called Squaw Creek here. And the reason they call it Squaw Creek is that there were these 7 sisters who were orphaned, and they came down from somewhere up toward the Kuskokwim, and they came and floated their kayaks up this river. It's a little creek, actually, more so than a river. And they all kind of settled around this creek, and they all married white men, and they all have the dominant last names of this community. All of the big groups of family that are still here, most of them descend from these 7 sisters. So right now I'm in the process of working on changing the name from the derogatory slur Squaw Creek to Ulla Creek, or Makaluk Creek, which is grandmother, or some other word that references that story in a more respectful way. But one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the fact that these women knew that in order to survive at that time, they were going to have to marry white men, and that their children were going to do better in the world if they became white. So this is kind of the reality that has shaped my entire community. And up until I was even in my early 20s, that was still kind of the accepted reality for a lot of people, that you can see that everyone who had family who married white did better. They just generally did better. They had more money, they were more sort of conventionally successful. And that what right now a lot of us are trying to do is learn all the traditions that they didn't teach us because they wanted us to succeed in life, and forgiving them for making that decision for their own survival and for our survival, even if it cost us a lot. So it's an interesting kind of undertaking to change that name. And I think spiritually there's a lot of community work to be done, because there are people in the community who descend from those women who are like, I don't want to change the name, that's our history, you know, and like opening up those conversations with those people too. So and then I could probably go on, but I feel like that's kind of my most recent experience with Land Acknowledgement, is because at this point, the name of that creek, whatever it was in Yup'ik, that name is gone. Nobody knows what that name was now. So how do we take a name for that creek that references our Yup'ik heritage, that then in 40 years, everyone will know that creek as whatever name we choose, and it won't have the sort of the derogatory connotation, like taking the resiliency instead of hanging on to the colonization. Take our resiliency out of those experiences and move forward with that instead. So yeah.
Wow, beautiful. That's so exciting. We've talked about so many different things at different times, but I hadn't heard that effort, and it's just fantastic. Thank you. Emily, you're a forerunner of Land Acknowledgement, from Tuggeght to Lenapehoking, as a dancer, a choreographer, a storyteller, and an artist. You've expanded into an activist in this movement. Explain why Land Acknowledgement is so important to your practice.
Hi, everyone. Amber, I think this will be by way of answering the question, Asia. Amber, I so appreciate all of your work and this work too of rematriating name, and it makes, just as you were finishing by wrapping up by saying that the original place name of that river is lost. Like, that's such a profound loss of knowledge, because our place names are knowledge. Like the place name where you are from, Churning Waters, that means there's so much information, like necessary information in place name. And you know, I have some colleagues, sisters in Minnesota, Makoche, Carly and Kate Bean, they're Dakota, and they've been working on place name change there that's having a lot of effect. They've been at it for years with the Bere Makaska renaming the lake. right in what is called Minneapolis. And just watching the depth of community work in their work, and then the challenge that they face by settlers still. And it's a profound reclaiming, and that it's led by women. And it is about that rematriative process, which is what land acknowledgement is. I'm here on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the Lenape-Hoking, and the focus that I understand here is about the forced removal of Lenape people, and how land acknowledgements and knowing place is about creating pathways for Lenape people who want to return home to be able to do so. And so land acknowledgement becomes so much more right away, so much more than spoken word. And it is spoken, it is embodied, it is visual, it is processed, but it's also civic, and it's also engagement with place in such a deep relational way that you're engaging with ancestors of that place, both past ancestors and the ancestors who are coming in the future via the people who are alive right now. And so that relationality via place name is just so important. And that's where I've come to understand land acknowledgement. And, that I think in relation to my body-based work, to me, they've always been intertwined, though I think I've learned more about the technique of land acknowledgement, just like I've learned more about the technique of making performance as I've been doing it for a few decades. But to me, that dance is everything, that it's this conversation across space and time, that it's my, body process of saying words, my gestures, the language, it's the tree outside, it's the breeze from the fan, it's the migratory birds, it's the fish that are being caught now in Alaska and other, that dance is all of this. To me, dance is also so relational and about knowing and understanding where you are, where the dance is occurring, where your body is being embodied in relationship to place. So to me, knowing place comes in so many forms, in embodied forms, through dance and through acknowledgement as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Amber, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that, and because I neglected to do that with our transitions here. But this is such an important dialogue between leaders, which is a privilege just to hold the space for that.
Well, Juliana, for that, as I'm listening to Emily speak about land acknowledgement, a part of that land acknowledgement is a form of spiritual reparation for so many things. And I as a young person, I grew up Yup'ik dancing, and I was never a great talent in Yup'ik. That's not my medium as much, but I love it. And I see that in I'm learning more and more as I've grown how all of those movements came directly from the land and from place, and all of the language and all of the activity comes from place. But the other thing that is really sometimes not always considered is that now, our old Yup'ik place names always either had a reference to nature or a reference to something that happened there. So if there were areas where they would reference battles in different ways, talking about there's one story where there was a river and one of the men in a kayak during war times was blew his snot into the water, his phlegm, and they call it Snot Creek because that phlegm traveled down the creek and there were warriors from the other side behind him, and they saw his snot and they knew he was up there. They knew those people were there, and then they went and there was a battle. And so there's these little ways that we reference happenings that just the single word carries the story. And like when you're talking about how Indigenous history has been carried through the names that people who experienced great hardship, how they named those places and then carried that history on to their ancestors, like the Trail of Tears, or there was a place in Kodiak, the name was called the place where it was, I think the word was sticking your hands in ice cold water, because that was the spot where the Yup'ik people in Kodiak lost the battle with the Russians that ultimately ended up with the Russians settling there. The place where we go numb is what that would be in English, but in Alutiiq, in Sugpiaq, in the Sugpiaq language, it was putting your hands in cold water, because that's all that you would have to say. That was where that loss happened. So the place names that we carry forward now, no matter what those places were called before, they carry our history now. And I think a lot of the work for me lately, I do a lot of work with MMIWG and Two-Spirited people as well. And I am seeing, I can trace those stories like back several generations. I was having a conversation with Anita Lucchese, who developed the database, and she was telling me the story of her great-grandmother, and it was almost the same as mine, where we both recognized that both of our great-grandmothers had been trafficked. And that's not how our families would describe them now, but that's the reality, and that's the reality for very many people who are alive now. So when we talk about land acknowledgement, it takes us so deep into the healing of our people. And I think when we're calling up all of those names, just like they're doing in Minnesota, you never know what kind of reaction you're going to get, because it calls up so much history for individual families. And I think when you live in a place where people carry those stories forward within their own families and everybody knows each other's family story, it requires a lot of delicacy and like the utmost respect. How you speak about those things matters. And so I really appreciate everything you said, Emily, and I see that in my own work, although my work isn't so much in the form of movement, but but they're related, you know, it's all related. So anyway, I'm not sure if that was a very organized response, but.
And there's so much movement in your work, like all of the, I see Yup'ik in your work so deeply, and just how the stories and the knowledge comes through from what you draw, and it's incredible. Yeah.
Emily, you've witnessed, participated in, led many land acknowledgements, and I wonder if you could share with us through images and story some of the experiences, what you've learned from land acknowledgement and how it's moving you forward.
Yeah, I can, let me share my screen here, and I'll try to do this in just sort of like a sharing the images and talking kind of way, because it can, you know, it's part of a presentation that I do when I'm teaching workshops or leading folks who, you know, people who are settlers who are stepping into a process of land acknowledgement sometimes step into it without having any idea what it is. And so in a way, I always like to think both about technical aspects, but also about like the best possible scenarios, which is where we began, you know, where our place names are rematriated, where the indigenous nations of the land that is currently called the US are the ones governing the land that is currently called the US, and land back, you know, that the land itself is rematriated back to us. That is the place in which we are going. That is the place that I try to be in and to conjure. And so, yeah, so I guess I just offer that as a start. And let's see if this works. Okay, do you kind of see my my grandma's wallet here?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I just need to know, okay, great. So this, I just love to start by sharing this. This is a wallet that my grandma made, my grandma Hannah. And it's of caribou hide and beads, and she won a ribbon for it at the state fair. And it's the wallet that I carry with me all the time. And I recently wrote an essay and story about it because I've lost this wallet twice. Once it fell out of my pocket when I lived in Minnesota Makoche, and it was found by somebody and who was experiencing homelessness, and they wanted to give it back to me, but they wanted to meet me in person. And so the shelter where that person stayed called me and said that he was there and wanted to meet me, and I was like, great. You know, I'll come over. And they're like, oh, well, he's not here. I said, okay, when is he there? And, you know, of course, you never know. Like it's, and so I would just stop by that shelter every once in a while to see if we could meet, see if I could meet him, to see if I could return or have the wallet returned. And I'd leave little gifts and things, and our timing just never worked out, or maybe I gave up too soon or something, and we never met. But years later, I received this wallet in the mail. From him or from the shelter, I don't know. And everything that was in it was still inside of it. And so this wallet carries that story now, and the story of its return. And I'm sad that I've never met this person, but like I think about this person a lot because it's so much a part of this wallet and this object that I carry with me all the time. And the second time that I lost it, I was in a rehearsal process for the thank you bar, actually, in Duwamish land. And I was dancing with my eyes closed, as I often do. And I was improvising, and there was a video camera on, and there was a mirror behind me. And there were two musicians I was working with, and I was dancing with my eyes closed. And somebody came in while I was dancing and took my purse, and the wallet was inside of it. And when I realized my purse was gone, I could look back at the video and see this person come in and take my purse away. And I was very upset. And I figured, well, I've lost the wallet once. That's it. But I didn't assume that the wallet would come back to me again. But this time, a few weeks later, the wallet came back in the mail again. And this time it was from the Duwamish post office, or Seattle post office, with a note that said, this time everything in it was gone except my ID. And the note said that people often do this, like they'll take something and then take what they need or want out of it, and then put the objects or the items they don't need or want into the post office boxes. And it's the Seattle post office's policy to return what is not theirs, which I so appreciate that. I appreciate that so much, because this beautiful belonging, hand-stitched by my grandma, was returned to me because the Seattle post office has this policy to return what is not theirs. And that is a beautiful way to think of land acknowledgement, right? And this, as a choreographer, I make notes all the time. These are notes from a workshop on a constellatory decolonial process. And these words here are decolonial, radical, not radial, and simple. And to me, these words are so intertwined, right? Like the most radical acts often come from the most simple concepts, like return what is not yours. And of course, there are many layers of complexity involved in the very simple acts, of creating an artwork or returning what is not yours. But there's a way in which the interweavings between these words and the processes around these words are very related. And I like to think of the radical all the time, radical decolonial love, like my friend Karen Recollet writes about. And this thought that some people think that it's radical to think that land could be returned, but it's not. It's actually very simple. Return what is yours. In terms of land acknowledgements themselves, and like I said, that's what we're after, right? in terms of land acknowledgements themselves, there are some beautiful examples. These are just some of my favorites. Those of you who are not in Alaska might not have seen this. This is the biggest land acknowledgement I've ever seen. This is the Nina. This is on the outside of the Anchorage Museum. It's right on a busy street. It's just like there and it's present, and I think it's really gorgeous. And it's matched. I know that there are many internal workings within the museum that I don't know, and I won't necessarily go into. I've done a little bit of work within the museum that those experiences have always been good. Chief Aaron Liggett is one of the curators there. Melissa Chaganoff used to work there, and I know that there's some internal processes that are, if not on pace with how big this land acknowledgement is, at least are working. And I guess I just mentioned that because it's very true that land acknowledgements, just as like, if you take away everything that Amber and I have been talking about, land acknowledgement can actually become very dangerous. Like it can become something that a person or an organization or an institution uses to kind of show that they're doing something right when they're not, or they can use it to say, okay, there, we've done the work. Like when actually you actually have to, decolonize all of the systems within your organization. And one organization that's really doing that well is Abrams Art Center here on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And they were one of the first theaters and institutions here in Lenape-Hoking to start land acknowledgement. And we created this one along with representatives from the Lenape Center a few years ago. And the process was really good. The process itself was generous. It took a long time, and it took a lot of back and forth, and it took a lot of thinking about relationality, and it took a lot of thinking about how Abrams, as they were stepping into writing this with us, how they could also take immediate actions, build relationships with local Indigenous folks, build processes where people could rehearse there, and like just beginning process of that relationality. And I like this one so much because the process was so good that Abrams was gifted these words in language to be part of the acknowledgement. And my pronunciation might be a little bit off for sure, but what I've learned is that it's Nuhe Linda Muhano Elapeaku Lenape-Hoking Gulashihimo Enta Akpeaku. So we're glad you people came here to Lenape-Hoking. Live well while you are here. And Abrams is in the process of revamping their land acknowledgement, which is something I always talk about it as embodied land acknowledgement, and that it's living. And land acknowledgements are a living process. And so the words should shift as your relationships shift, as your knowledge shifts, as things around you shift, as sovereignty is gained, the acknowledgement must change with those realities. And so we're reworking it with Lenape folks, Joe and Ripper Widow. And Abrams is working on, like I mentioned at the beginning, paths for, as an art center, how can they create pathways for Lenape artists who want to do work in their homeland and who may have never been to their homeland? How can they create pathways for those artists to be here? And then from there, like Mia Whittle and I talk about that. They're a young activist and artist, and their first trip here, now they have so many relationships here, and they're starting to build process within their homeland, even though they don't live in their homeland, but they needed that trip here to start to build those relationships. And so all of those pathways that we help build, help foster, again, that Indigenous relationality and those conciliatory relationships. And then this is just another example in Minnesota Makoche, the Webb Museum worked on this acknowledgement with Dakota leaders. And I just use this one as an example because they make reparation a part of their land acknowledgement, maybe in a small way, but it's a step. So they waive admission for Dakota and all Indigenous peoples. And that's stated in their land acknowledgement. So to me, an institution's land acknowledgement needs to talk about action, needs to say, okay, here's what we are committed to doing. And then again, as a living process, that can change, that can be added to, that can grow, and that can deepen. And I think if your organization is not ready to commit to any action, I think it's okay to say that, but in a process of figuring out what those actions need to be, you know? But as Amber and I have been talking about, land acknowledgement and embodying relationality and embodying land acknowledgement can be more than words. This is a project that myself and Karen Mekele, who I mentioned before, she's a Cree futurist living in Toronto. We host these monthly fires at Abrams Art Center. And the project itself is called Conciliatory Mappings in Light and Dark Matter. And they're Indigenous held spaces where the fire is centered and where we try to learn from the fire. And I'll just put this definition of conciliatory here. And I'm just gonna read something that Karen and I wrote about the fires because it talks about land acknowledgement in a really different way. So we wrote this essay about the fires and we said, fire's capacities as a relative or kin, specifically situated on Lenape homelands, creates a hub space for Indigenous sociality through forms of intimacy. As the fire is cared for, the fire in turn creates space and calls people in. The fire's sound and gestures and movement and warmth become the technologies for kin in the making. Neighbor meeting neighbor, child meeting fire, settler meeting round dance, an indigenously defined space. The space itself, filled at times with drum or song or poem or story, and silence becomes an in-between space full of care, welcome, pause, and eclipse. This is otherworlding. This is futurity building. These gatherings that center fire as a technology extend territorial acknowledgements by moving people into relation, into forms of Indigenous sociality, necessitating the accompanying responsibilities embedded within these formations. We consider a more sustaining and challenging land activation, rather than simple reproductions of theoretical frameworks that accommodate activists within an already leftist politic. Consequently, our provocations deeply engage land acknowledgements as an embodiment practice. We ask, can embodied forms of dance making and gathering bring us out of this trap of a superficial land acknowledgement and into a space of landing with each other, into a space where equity and balance are possible? And my friends, I'll just show a few more photos of the fire, just to add to that last bit that we wrote about. My friends and scholars, Dylan Robinson, he's a Stolo scholar based in Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish lands, and Camille Usher, Coast Salish artist. And Karen and I have been talking about gatherings and meeting about gatherings. And also when Dylan and Karen and Camille and I had a residency together, we started to talk about acknowledgement and started to question if acknowledgement is the right word anymore. Like as the work gets deeper, you know, as Amber is starting to rematriate names, maybe there's a different, maybe we start to call this thing that we've started to know as land acknowledgement something different. And maybe that can start to activate different forms as well. This is a garden, which this is one of my favorite land acknowledgements ever. This is a garden planted with Shashapsehing black flint corn, corn from here in Lenape-Hoking. There's a little written land acknowledgement there in the center, but it's corn. It's in the second generation of growing right now. It's a Three Sisters garden. And I think that garden and that statement of the plants growing, that is rematriative process. And actually Mia Whittle, who I talked about earlier, I introduced her to the corn when they were here on their first trip last year, and they got to harvest some of this black flint corn. So those are just some examples, and I'm just gonna skip ahead to this photo of this tree. This is my favorite tree in Lenape-Hoking. This was in the fall. But when we speak of civic engagement, like the city is about to destroy the park that this tree is in. So the city of New York, the occupying city of New York, is going to cut down 1,000 trees and 47 acres of this park. It's a quite controversial plan, obviously. And I just keep thinking, and we're fighting it, and we're having a conciliatory fire to honor the trees next week. But I just keep thinking, like, that's not your land to mess with, is what I think of. you know? And I think of how relationship with land needs to be so completely separate from these systems that that colonialism has created and that we have lived under for hundreds of years. Those systems that we speak of needing to be dismantled need to be dismantled right now. Like the killing 1,000 trees in the midst of a climate crisis, in the midst of a pandemic. This is the only park that this mostly lower income, this neighborhood that is mostly made of Black and Indigenous and other people of color, it is the only place. Like it's so irresponsible and so un-Indigenous to make an act against the land like this, that I just feel like land acknowledgement is part of shifting that kind of irresponsible behavior as well. And it's more than irresponsible, but that's just the best word that's coming to mind right now. Yeah, those are some thoughts.
Wow. Why, Emily, why are the trees being cut down?
So Manhattan is coastal, obviously. And the Lower East Side does need some flood protection. Hurricane Sandy was a massive hurricane that happened about 6 years ago. And in those 6 years, the city and about 20 neighborhood organizations came up with a plan to provide flood protection for the Lower East Side and Chinatown. The neighborhood that I live in is the Lower East Side, but they're connected. And so they came up with a plan that was about resiliency and about flood protection and about community engagement, which of course, that's what resiliency really is. But in the fall of this last year, the city very suddenly changed the plan, which is the thing that we're fighting, and there's a lawsuit against that action. And so now the city's plan, without any community involvement, is to destroy the park, cut down the trees, add 6 feet of dirt, and rebuild the park. So that process will take, they say 5 years, it will probably take longer, but it destroys the park in the interim. The other plan did not destroy the park. Yeah, so I mean, there's no responsible reason why they're cutting down the trees or why this is the plan that they're going with. There are other reasons, like their plan doesn't, the city's plan doesn't stop the flow of traffic on the FDR as much as the other plan did. So in some ways, the city is putting forth a plan for flood mitigation that preserves flow of traffic beyond saving 1,000 trees, you know? To me, that's a pretty ill thought through plan.
And you've been working on this project for a while, like tracing the change in course for.
Yeah, and there's a neighborhood organization that's been very active in fighting the city on this plan. Next week we'll have actually an in-person gathering at the amphitheater at Abrams Arts Center. We won't have a central fire, but people will have candles. Some amazing artists and activists: Joseph Pierce, Demian Dinayaji, Jasmine Sanchez, Joe Whittle, Tatiana Benali, one other I'm forgetting, are going to share words in this. Like it's a local issue, but it's a global issue. It's a global issue of ecocide against land that continuously and consistently harms Black and Indigenous people at the hands of colonial governments. Purposely do this, specifically in coastal places, as we know in Alaska as well, but all over the world. And so these artists and activists who will share on Thursday are bringing that into this conversation as well. And then we will process and spend time with the trees while they're still with us, and really to extend our honor and our gratitude to the trees, because they are sentient beings who deserve honor and gratitude. And so we'll try to build those relationships while we have time with them. And I guess that's a form of land acknowledgement too. I hadn't thought of that quite in that context, but and guiding whomever comes on next Thursday into that process, really for the trees. Like, let's remove the, humans, we center ourselves all the time as, because we do, but maybe if we can try to shift that and really center our relationships, center the trees in this case, maybe that would be a better thing to do for a little while.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a short film, a very interesting experimental film in the collection at the Walker Art Center, which was conceived by Theaster Gates in response to a decision within the city of Minneapolis to cut down a bunch of trees. And he created a performance which involved the gradual cutting down of that tree with like this sustained, beautiful live performance, a piece of music by a horn player. So these two Black men were kind of bearing witness and creating a ritual of acknowledgement around land and displacement at the same time. So there's an interesting, I'm sure, in many other connected movements, like what you're speaking of today.
Oh, and what Amber works with so much on highlighting the genocide of Indigenous women and girls and trans and Two-Spirit people, that is exactly related to extractive industries, which are exactly industries that do not regard the land in any sort of care form. And so that has direct impact on the lives and now the missing and the murdered lives of Indigenous women. And it's absolutely connected to land. And so as we're speaking of land acknowledgement, it is, as Amber said, it goes very, very quickly, very deeply into exactly our very centers. Yeah.
Amber, I wanted to invite you to, reflect and comment on these thoughts that Emily's sharing now and her earlier presentation.
Well, what a beautiful presentation. Having small pieces of things that my great grandmother made, and like knowing how prized those are, I was just so happy to see that you were able to get your get it back. That's beautiful. But I'm thinking of what you said about how the word for land acknowledgement could change over time, and really like what you're talking about, like land acknowledgement is a way of life. It's our way of life. And so everything about land acknowledgement is about reclaiming the way that we have traditionally lived and been in space with, like how we've existed in our environment, and that we're a part of that environment, and that we're not, it's not possible to separate us from that, because everything about all of our cultures is connective and is directly like grown around the places where we existed and exist still, and I think that that's a really powerful declaration to make as a Native person, that like I recognize that I have a right to my culture, and my culture means that I practice acknowledging land and animals and all of the things that feed me. And that's I think that's like really just getting to the root of what it's about. But the other thing that it made me think of is a lot of the sort of healing that goes into that work when you're dealing with lateral oppression and internalized oppression, where I feel like a lot of what happened during ANCSA, which this gets political very quickly, but it's just what came to me is that, so we have these groups, we were separated into all these groups and we became incorporated, and it became in some ways a kind of a competition, like further colonizing how we exist with each other. And so many people here were sent away from their land, and their identity was essentially annihilated in so many ways. And so many of us have been trying to reclaim what our parents or our grandparents or their parents lost in boarding schools. And there's like a weight to that, even just saying that out loud, that's just, it's profoundly painful to even acknowledge it for so many people. So you're also asking people to acknowledge their own hurt, and that can be really challenging. But what I'm really thinking about as a result of this conversation is, how do we demand of our corporations that they continue to do that work, decolonizing and indigenizing how they function? Like, they've been put in this place to be the go-between between us and like money, right? Us and capitalism, and really we're allowed to be who we are, and we can revamp that. We can completely create an organization that does something for us, that is of us and not of this sort of external force. So it's really like, just when I'm hearing Emily talk, I'm realizing that that's completely possible, and it's a beautiful thing. And I can see that happening in my lifetime. And like the next couple generations of people that are growing up knowing these terms, like just watching those little girls harvesting that corn and all of the meaning and the name Three Sisters, you know, the corn and squash and beans and all of that knowledge, it's right there, you know. And all of the people here I know that are like just graduating from high school, and they're talking about colonization, they're talking about these big concepts. It's like, you know, every day I'm waking up and I'm asking myself, how am I there for these just beautiful bright lights, these young people that are the fire, they're catching, everything's catching, you know. And it's so, you know, when I start feeling really heartbroken for some of the other things that we fight, I just have to take a step back and be like, but wait, there's all this beauty in all this work we've been doing, and that's not going to go away, you know. So anyway, that's kind of just my thoughts watching your presentation.
Wow. So Emily, you've been more recently deeply engaged in creating social and economic equity for artists. And I want to talk a little bit more about how the work of, creating new futures is rooted in land acknowledgement. Could you explore with us a little bit more about this work that you're doing, this movement that you're sparking?
I think, well, coming to what Amber was just saying, these like, well, first I really appreciate what you just said, Amber, because last night I was watching, who is that? John Oliver, and it was like a bit on rent subsidies and like just how messed up things are right now. And it just like, I think Amber and I share this, like there's like, have like see so much possibility and like see the future in like see it and know that future, that better future is possible. Like I'm just right there, and I'm right there all the time. But then like hopeful and visioning and working toward, but then like personally, I feel like that kind of like hope and drive and like knowledge of the beauty that is coming to me personally can sometimes be met with like really, really a deep darkness. And last night I was getting to that point, just in like seeing the reification of systems that are so wrong, and seeing in this moment of institutions, for example, reopening when they haven't done the work that they need to do on any kind of anti-racist. They haven't done their work they don't deserve to open, right? Like, and so there's a way in which I kind of like, I was getting really down last night, which led into this morning, but now it's shifting through this conversation. So I'm very grateful for that. And creating new futures is a document, it's a process. It was born of this time of coronavirus where artists were receiving just flat out massive cancellations of all of our work and processes and timelines, and not to mention fees. And a group of artists came together via social media. There are 10 of us who got together, and in this very urgent time of needing to say that this is wrong, as well as all of the systems in the performing arts field that are really centered in mostly like white heteropatriarchal viewpoints are also wrong. And so we wrote this over 200-page document together that really excavated, as one of the working group members, Karen Sherman says, really excavated a lot of just the realities, the problematic realities that exist within the performing arts field. And of course, that mirrors the problematic realities that exist in pretty much every system in what is called the United States. And but we did it in this hopeful way where we're like, all right, here are the problems, but we know that there are alternatives, and here are some thoughts about that. And that document has really, it did a lot to call attention to the inequities and unethical behavior in the performing arts world, where arts workers of all kinds aren't working in any kind of fair labor processes, aren't receiving compensation for work on any kind of equitable scale, are doing the labor of cultural work, but are not recognized or compensated in correct ways. And that creating new futures is continuing now with a group of people who are moving it into phase 2. And we hope it's an ongoing and deeply engaged process that pulls in conversations with leaders at every institution and at every layer of performing arts, because we need to, as I just keep really seeing, like, I really wish, and I actually really hope for some of the institutions to not come back. And I know that can seem really harsh and stark, but I hope, and what I want is for individuals, institutions, organizations to, in this moment, recognize the behavior that they've been engaged in that is racist and colonial and against Black liberation and against Indigenous sovereignty, and work to change those structures. And just like land acknowledgement, that's a personal process and that's an organizational process, but it must be engaged with, and you have to start that work. And if your organization or your institution or that place that employs you is not doing that work, I don't think that institution is a place that needs to stay in existence. Every organization can start with the first step, of course, but like start those steps. Like, we're not out here protesting for anything other than radical change, for transformation, for liberation, and for sovereignty. And it takes especially it takes our cultural institutions to lead that way. You know, if you're not leading in that path, what are you leading? You know?
Yeah. Thank you. And what are you thinking, Amber? If you would like to respond, I certainly. I think I'm going to unmute you. Amber, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
I thought I had unmuted, but I had not. I'm just thinking 100% yes to everything that Emily just said. I mean, so much of the work, it's such an interesting kind of work to be doing, because, you know, every day I'm doing that work inside myself, and then trying to find ways to call people up instead of just calling people out. Like being connective instead of destructive. Like we can hold people accountable in our own Indigenous ways that we always have had and always have used. And I think that it's conversations like these that really do, when I start to feel pretty hopeless about what's happening, that really do remind me that there are millions of people working toward the same things that we're working toward. And that energy, that collective energy is so much more powerful than any kind of destructive energy. And all of these things we've been fighting, all of these things we've been working toward have been happening for a really long time. I mean, just in the MMIW movement, you know, we're looking at 40 years of even longer than that of women, and it's always been Indigenous women fighting for these things, and we're carrying on their work. So when we no longer exist, there will be people carrying on our work. It's like, because energy and motion are cumulative and they have their own force. So I just think 100% yes. You know, you know, there are going to be setbacks, but I feel like right now in this time, there's an entire world of people realizing how much power they have collectively, and that's, you can't take that back. You know, you just can't. You can't take that away. Once people realize how powerful they are, then they will continue to believe in their own power. So yeah. So thank you for your words, Emily, and I agree with you 100%.
It's been such a pleasure to speak with you two today and to recognize the profound value of the connection that you maintain as Yup'ik women on far shores and disparate geographies, but that is the nature of Alaska. And by speaking and gathering and learning, we're moving forward. And I feel very privileged to be a part of that motion in this conversation weekly. I want to thank all of our listeners too for joining us, and ask if anybody has questions of our speakers today.
I'm so sorry. I actually have another meeting back to back with this one, so I have to, but if there are any questions, email me, I'll answer, or call me. It's I'm accessible most of the time, so, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Amber. Take care. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Amber.
I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us, and to remind you to tune in again next week. We will be having a conversation called How Can We Move Forward? Framing Civic Partnerships on Land Acknowledgement with Arjun Kvasnikoff from Niknalchik, the original pronunciation of the village called Ninilchik. He is a member of the Niknalchik village tribe. And that conversation will be together with several civic partners from Homer, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Representative Marion Applin, City of Homer, Councilwoman Donna Adderhold, and several people from Parks and Rec about erecting a permanent land acknowledgement for Tuggeght at the shore where we live.
Amazing.
Thank you all so much. Let's talk soon. Bye-bye.